Rain fell against the stone walls of Thornfield Estate in the summer of 1400, washing the ancient battlements clean while mist rolled across the Yorkshire moors like a living thing. The fortress rose from the land, as it had for 3 centuries, its grey towers sharp against an uncertain sky, its halls vast and cold, built for war but inhabited by silence. Inside, tapestry swayed in draughts that crept through arrow slits, and rushes scattered across floors did little to soften the sound of emptiness. Catherine of Thornfield, Duchess by marriage and prisoner by circumstance, moved through corridors lit only by narrow windows, her footsteps lost in spaces too large for one woman's grief. She was 26, dark-haired, gray-eyed, slender as a willow, married 2 years to a duke she saw perhaps twice in a season. He came to Thornfield when duty demanded, stayed 3 days at most, and departed before dawn, leaving only instructions for the steward and coin for the household. She did not know where he went. She did not ask. The marriage had been arranged between her father, a minor baron, and the duke's solicitors, a transaction of land and lineage that required her presence but not her voice. She had learned not to expect him. The estate ran itself. Servants moved like ghosts, tending fires, preparing meals, maintaining rooms no one entered. The steward, an old man named Oswin, managed accounts and spoke to her only when necessary, his answers clipped, his eyes averted. She was the Duchess, yes, but she was also alone, a title without power, a wife without a husband, a woman whose days stretched into weeks without conversation, without touch, without anything that resembled a life. Catherine had stopped counting the days. She rose at dawn, dressed herself. No lady's maid had been hired, none offered, ate bread and ale in the great hall at a table that could seat 40, walked the empty gardens when weather allowed, and spent afternoons in the solar, embroidering patterns she would never finish, reading psalters whose Latin she barely understood, staring at walls until twilight came and she could justify returning to bed. It was a kind of death, she thought, a dying that took years. Morning broke pale and soft over Thornfield. The rain departed, leaving the air washed clean and cool. Catherine woke to birdsong filtering through the narrow window of her chamber, a sound so ordinary it startled her. She rose slowly, pulling a wool kirtle over her linen shift, tying the laces at her sides with practiced efficiency. No mirror hung in the room. She had requested none, and she did not bother with her hair beyond braiding it loosely and pinning it beneath a simple veil. She descended the spiral stair, her hand trailing along stone walls worn smooth by centuries of touch, and emerged into the great hall where a fire burned low in the hearth. A servant, a girl no older than 15, set bread and cheese on the table and vanished before Catherine could speak. She ate standing, looking through the tall windows toward the garden, where roses had begun to bloom despite neglect. The garden called to her. It was the only place on the estate that felt hers, though it belonged to no one. Enclosed by low stone walls, half wild with weeds, it held the remnants of what must have once been carefully tended beds. Roses climbing wooden trellises, lavender gone woody and sparse, thyme creeping between stones. She had begun, in recent weeks, to pull weeds, to clear paths, to sing softly while she worked. Old songs her mother had taught her, melodies without words, just sound to fill the silence. She crossed the courtyard, her skirts brushing against damp stone, and pushed open the wooden gate. The garden smelled of earth and roses, sweet and green. Dew clung to petals, to leaves, to the hem of her kirtle as she knelt beside a tangle of bindweed choking a rosebush. She worked slowly, humming low in her throat, her hands dark with soil, her mind blessedly empty. She did not hear the horse approach. She did not hear the gate open. She heard only the voice, deep, uncertain, edged with something she could not name. "You sing." Catherine's hands stilled. Her breath caught. She turned slowly, still kneeling, and looked up. A man stood at the garden gate, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in riding leathers muddied from travel, dark hair damp with mist, blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. She knew him instantly, though she had not seen him in 6 months. Her husband, Edward, Duke of Wentworth. If you too cherish period stories of love, loneliness, and the courage to hope again, check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because every week we bring you a new tale of hearts finding their way home, and you won't want to miss a single one. Edward had not expected her to be here. He had not expected her to be anywhere, really. Thornfield was so vast, its mistress so rarely seen, that he had imagined her tucked away in some distant solar, occupied with needlework or prayers, the safe, silent existence of a nobly born wife. He had not imagined this. A woman on her knees in the dirt, her veil slipping back to reveal dark hair unbound, her hands stained with earth, her voice rising in song as though she were not a duchess but a village girl tending her mother's plot. She was more real than he remembered. He had married her 2 years prior in a chapel he did not choose, witnessed by families he barely knew, fulfilling an obligation his late father had arranged before dying. Catherine had been 17 then, pale and silent, standing beside him in a gown too large for her frame, speaking vows she did not mean to a man she would not know. He had felt the wrongness of it even then, this transaction dressed as sacrament, but he had honored it. He had given her his name, his estate, his coin. He had not given her himself. He had left the morning after the wedding and returned only twice since, each visit brief, each departure hasty. He told himself it was kindness, this absence, that she would prefer a husband who did not intrude, did not demand, did not expect her to perform affection she could not feel. He had other estates to manage, other responsibilities. Thornfield could function without him, but standing here, watching her rise slowly from the garden bed, her gray eyes wide with something that might have been fear or surprise or simply resignation, he realized he had not been kind. He had been a coward. "Forgive me," he said, his voice rough from days of riding. "I did not mean to startle you." Catherine brushed soil from her hands, though it clung stubbornly to her palms, and inclined her head in the smallest gesture of acknowledgement. "You are not expected, my lord." "I know." He stepped into the garden, closing the gate behind him, and she took a half-step back, not fleeing but wary, like a deer scenting something unfamiliar. "I should have sent word." "You owe me no word." Her voice was quiet, even, devoid of accusation, which somehow made it worse. "This is your home." "It is yours," he corrected, though the words felt hollow. Her mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost bitter. "Is it?" The question hung between them, unanswerable. Edward looked past her at the garden, half tamed, half wild, clearly tended by hands that had no help, no guidance, only persistence. "You did this? There is little else to do." He flinched. He deserved that. "I did not know you sang," he said, grasping for something, anything, to bridge the chasm he had created. Catherine's gaze dropped to her hands, still dark with earth. "I did not know anyone was listening." They stood in the garden as the sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the mist, and neither moved toward the house. Edward wanted to ask her 100 questions. Why she was alone, why no servants attended her, why the estate felt like a tomb. But the words tangled in his throat. Catherine remained where she was, her hands folded now, her posture straight despite the weariness he could see in the line of her shoulders. "How long do you stay this time?" she asked finally, her tone careful, neutral. "I do not know," Edward admitted. "I came because—" He stopped. Because why? Because guilt had finally outweighed avoidance? Because his steward at Ravenscroft had mentioned in passing that Thornfield's accounts showed no expenditures for household staff beyond the most essential, and Edward had realized he did not even know who served his wife, or if anyone did? "Because you remembered you have a wife?" Catherine supplied, and this time there was no mistaking the edge in her voice. Edward met her gaze. "Yes." The honesty seemed to surprise her. Her lips parted, then closed. She looked away toward the roses climbing the trellis, their petals deep red, almost the color of blood. "You need not stay on my account." "Perhaps I should stay on my own." She looked back at him, her gray eyes searching his face for something, sincerity perhaps, or simply an explanation for this sudden appearance. Why now? Edward exhaled slowly. Because I have been a poor husband and a worse man. And I would like... He hesitated, unsure of what he wanted, only that this cold, silent marriage could not continue. I would like to know you. Catherine's expression did not soften, but something flickered in her eyes, too quick to name. You had 2 years for that. I know. And you chose absence. I did. She tilted her head slightly, studying him as though he were a puzzle she could not solve. What changed? Edward looked at her, truly looked, not the glance of a stranger, but the attention owed to someone whose life he had shaped and then abandoned. He saw the loneliness in her, worn like a second skin, and he saw the quiet strength that had kept her here, tending a garden no one saw, singing songs no one heard. He saw what his absence had cost. I heard you sing, he said quietly, and I realized I did not know your voice. In the comments below, tell me, have you ever felt invisible in your own life? If this moment touched your heart, write, I heard you singing, so I know you're feeling this story with me. Edward left Catherine in the garden and sought out Oswin, the steward, finding him in the estate office, a cramped room off the great hall where ledgers lined the walls, and a fire burned year-round to keep the damp at bay. The old man rose stiffly when Edward entered, his weathered face betraying no surprise, only the quiet acceptance of someone who had served the Wentworth family for 40 years. My lord, Oswin said, bowing his head, I did not know you had arrived. This morning. Edward closed the door behind him and remained standing. I want an accounting, Oswin. Not of coin. I know the estate is solvent. I want to know what manner of household my wife keeps. Oswin's expression did not change, but his silence spoke volumes. Speak plainly, Edward said, his voice hardening. How many servants attend the Duchess? 3, my lord, a scullery maid, a cook, and myself. Edward stared at him. 3. Yes, my lord. For an estate of this size? The Duchess requested no more. That stopped him. She requested? Oswin shifted his weight, uncomfortable now. When your lordship first brought her here, you instructed me to see to her needs. I engaged a household of 12, ladies, maids, grooms, chamberers. But within a month the Duchess dismissed them all, save for those necessary to keep the kitchen and fires. Edward felt something cold settle in his chest. Why? She did not say, my lord, but I observed... Oswin hesitated, then continued carefully. She found their presence uncomfortable. They did not know how to serve a duchess who preferred solitude, and she did not know how to command servants who expected a lady accustomed to luxury. Edward closed his eyes briefly. She was 17. Yes, my lord. And I left her here, alone. Oswin said nothing, which was answer enough. Edward opened his eyes and looked at the ledgers, neat rows of figures documenting 2 years of his wife's life, reduced to expenses for bread and candles. Does she go into the village? No, my lord. Does she receive visitors? None have come. Letters? I have seen none, my lord. Edward's jaw tightened. He had not written. Not once. He had sent coin quarterly through his solicitor and assumed that was sufficient. He had been wrong. Catastrophically wrong. I want the household restored, Edward said, his voice low but firm. Engage proper staff, ladies' maids, chamberers, grooms, whatever is customary, and tell them they serve a duchess who deserves better than I have given her. Oswin bowed his head. As you wish, my lord. Chapter 5. The Hall at Supper. That evening, Catherine entered the great hall for supper and found it transformed. Candles blazed in iron chandeliers, their light warm and golden, banishing shadows to the corners. The long table had been set not at one end as she usually ate, but in the center, with 2 places laid opposite each other. A fire roared in the hearth, and the air smelled of roasted fowl and bread. Edward stood near the hearth, still dressed in his riding leathers but cleaner now, his hair damp from washing. He turned when she entered, and for a moment neither spoke. Catherine felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, not quite anger, not quite hope. "You did not need to do this." "I did," Edward said simply. He gestured to the table. "Will you sit?" She hesitated, then crossed the hall, her skirts whispering against the rushes. She took the seat he indicated, and he sat across from her, the table between them both a barrier and a bridge. A servant, the young scullery maid, brought wine and trenchers of bread, then retreated quickly. They ate in silence at first, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the quiet scrape of knives against wood. Catherine kept her gaze on her plate, uncertain what to say, how to navigate this sudden shift from abandonment to attention. It was Edward who broke the silence. "Tell me about your days," he said. "What do you do when I am not here?" Catherine's hands stilled. She looked up, meeting his eyes across the table. "I exist, my lord. I wake. I eat. I walk the garden. I sleep. That is all? What else is there?" The question was not bitter, only honest, and Edward felt it like a blade between his ribs. "Whatever you wish," he said quietly. "This is your home, Catherine. You may do as you please." "May I?" She set down her knife, her expression calm, but her voice edged with something sharper. "I am a duchess, yes, but I am also a wife you do not want, in a house too large for one woman, in a life I did not choose. What I wish, my lord, matters very little." Edward leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his gaze steady. "It matters to me." "Since when?" "Since I heard you singing." Catherine looked away toward the fire, and for a long moment she said nothing. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "I sang because there was no one to hear. I tended the garden because there was nothing else. I dismissed the servants because they looked at me as though I were a child playing dress-up, and I could not bear it." She turned back to him. "You gave me a title, Edward. You did not give me a place." The use of his name, spoken for perhaps the first time in their marriage, struck him more deeply than any accusation could have. "I know," he said, "and I am sorry." After supper, Edward walked Catherine to the base of the tower stair that led to her chamber. The hall had emptied, the fire burning low, and the silence between them felt less hostile now, more uncertain. Catherine paused with her hand on the stone newel post, looking up at him in the dim light. "Will you be here in the morning?" she asked. "Yes, and the morning after?" Edward heard the question beneath the question. "How long before you leave again?" "I do not know how long I will stay," he admitted, "but I will not leave without telling you first." Catherine nodded slowly, as though weighing his words for truth. "That is more than I have had." "It is the least you deserve." She studied him for a moment longer, then turned and began to climb the stair. Edward watched until she disappeared into the shadows above, then retreated to his own chamber, a room he had slept in perhaps 5 times in 2 years, cold and impersonal despite the fire a servant had lit. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, and felt the full weight of his failures. He had married Catherine because his father demanded it, because the alliance secured lands in the north, because it was his duty. But duty, he was learning, was not the same as care. He had given her safety, yes, and wealth, and a name that carried power. But he had not given her companionship, or kindness, or even basic respect. He had treated her like furniture, and she had survived it alone. Edward rose and went to the window, looking out over the moonlit moors. Somewhere below, in the garden, the roses Catherine tended were closing their petals against the night. He thought of her voice, rising in song, and realized he wanted to hear it again. Not by accident, not in secret, but because she chose to share it. He wanted to know her, and he had no idea where to begin. Dawn came soft and gray, mist clinging to the ground as Catherine descended to the hall and found Edward already there, dressed in simpler clothing now, a linen shirt and wool hose, his cloak discarded. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression reminded her of a man bracing for bad news. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." Catherine accepted bread and ale from the cook and sat, not across from him this time but 2 places down, a small assertion of distance. Edward noticed but did not comment. "I thought," he said carefully, "I might walk with you today, if you are going to the garden." Catherine paused mid-bite. "Why?" "Because I would like to see what you have done there. You saw it yesterday." "I saw it," Edward agreed, "but I did not see it through your eyes." Catherine set down her bread, regarding him with that same wary uncertainty. "This is strange, Edward. I know. You do not know me. I do not know you. We are strangers who share a name." "Then perhaps we should remedy that." She was silent for a long moment, then nodded once. "Very well, but you will need to work." Edward blinked. "Work?" "The garden does not tend itself." The faintest hint of something, amusement, challenge, flickered in her gray eyes. "If you wish to walk with me, you will also weed with me." Edward found himself smiling, the expression unfamiliar after so many months of grim duty. "Agreed." They went to the garden together as the sun burned off the mist, and Catherine handed him a small iron tool for digging, showing him where the bindweed choked the rose bushes and how to pull it without damaging the roots. Edward knelt in the dirt beside her, his hands unused to such work, his back already protesting, and for the first time in 2 years, he and his wife spoke. Not about their marriage, not about his absence, just small things. She told him the names of the roses. He told her about the estates he managed, the endless disputes over land and rents. She mentioned her childhood in her father's modest manner. He described his father's death and the responsibilities that had followed too soon. They did not solve anything that morning, but they began. That afternoon, while Edward met with Oswin to arrange for the new household staff, Catherine retreated to the solar where light streamed through tall windows and a wooden desk sat against the wall. She had not used it in months. What letters would she write, and to whom? Her father had died a year ago. She had learned of it through a terse message from his steward, delivered weeks after the burial. She had no siblings, no friends who knew where she had gone. But today, she opened the desk and found parchment, ink, a quill that needed mending. She sat and stared at the blank page for a long time. What could she say? That her husband had finally noticed her? That after 2 years of absence, he had spent one morning pulling weeds beside her, and she had felt for the first time since her wedding something other than numb? It felt too fragile to put into words, too uncertain to trust. Instead, she dipped the quill and wrote a single line. He came back. She did not send it. She folded the parchment and tucked it into the desk, a record for herself, a marker of the day something changed. On the 3rd day of Edward's stay, Oswin approached him in the estate office with an expression of such careful neutrality that Edward knew immediately the subject would be uncomfortable. "My lord," Oswin began, then hesitated. "Speak, Oswin." "Forgive me, but there is a matter of some delicacy." The steward glanced toward the door, ensuring it was closed. "The household has been asking, that is, there is some concern." "About what?" Oswin met his gaze. "About heirs, my lord." Edward went very still. He understood at once. A marriage 2 years old, a duke with no legitimate children, a duchess who lived in isolation. Of course, there would be questions, whispers, speculation about whether the marriage had even been consummated. It had not. Edward had spent his wedding night in a separate chamber, telling himself he would not force a frightened girl into his bed, that he would wait until she was ready, until she knew him. And then he had left the next morning and never returned long enough to revisit the question. "That is not your concern, Oswin," Edward said quietly. "No, my lord, but it is the concern of your family, your estates, your—" "I am aware of my responsibilities." Oswin bowed his head. "Of course, my lord." After the steward departed, Edward remained in the office, staring at the ledgers without seeing them. The question of heirs was not merely about duty or bloodlines. It was about the marriage itself, about whether he and Catherine would ever be more than strangers sharing a name. He thought of her in the garden, singing. He thought of her eyes, wary and watchful. He thought of the distance he had created and did not know how to cross. Rain returned on the fourth day, heavy and relentless, drumming against the slate roof and streaming down the tower walls. Catherine stood at the window of the solar, watching water pool in the courtyard, and felt the familiar weight of confinement settle over her. On days like this, the estate became a cage, its walls closing in, its silence oppressive. She heard footsteps on the stair and turned to find Edward in the doorway, his hair damp, his shirt clinging to his shoulders. He must have been outside when the rain began. "Are you well?" he asked. "I dislike the rain," Catherine admitted. "It makes Thornfield feel smaller." Edward stepped into the solar, looking around at the bare walls, the single desk, the absence of any comfort. "This room is grim. It is quiet. It is lonely." Catherine said nothing, and Edward crossed to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. They stood in silence watching the rain, and Catherine realized this was the longest they had been in the same room together without the buffer of work or servants or the formality of meals. "Catherine," Edward said quietly, "why did you stay?" She turned her head to look at him. "Stay. Here. At Thornfield. You could have left, gone back to your family, petitioned for annulment on grounds of abandonment. You had cause." Catherine looked back out at the rain. "Where would I go? My father is dead. I have no family. And an annulment." She shook her head. "That would require admitting I was unwanted. I may be lonely, Edward, but I am not without pride. You are not unwanted. Am I not?" She met his gaze again, and this time there was no wariness in her eyes, only a stark, painful honesty. "You married me and left the same day. You returned twice in 2 years, stayed 3 days at most, and never once asked if I was content. What would you call that, if not unwanted?" Edward had no answer that would not sound like an excuse. "I did not stay because I loved Thornfield," Catherine continued. "I stayed because leaving would mean admitting I have nowhere else. This is my prison, yes, but it is also the only home I have." The rain fell harder, and Edward stood beside his wife, feeling the enormity of what he had done, not in anger, not through cruelty, but through neglect, which might be worse. "I would like to give you more than a prison," he said finally. "Then stay," Catherine said. "Not for 3 days. Stay." On the 5th day, Edward discovered the library. It was not hidden exactly, but tucked away in the north tower, accessed by a narrow stair that seemed to lead nowhere. He found it by accident, searching for Catherine, and pushed open the heavy oak door to reveal a circular room lined floor to ceiling with books, manuscripts bound in leather, scrolls tied with ribbon, volumes he recognized from his father's collection, and many he did not. Catherine sat in the center of the room in a pool of sunlight, a book open on her lap, her veil discarded, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She looked up when he entered, and for a moment he saw her as she might have been if he had not abandoned her here, young, unguarded, allowed to simply exist. "I did not know you read," Edward said, stepping into the library. "You did not ask." He deserved that. He crossed to where she sat and looked at the book in her lap, Latin text, religious in nature. "You read Latin?" "My father insisted I learn." Catherine closed the book carefully, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. "He said a woman should be able to read scripture without a priest's interpretation." Edward sat on the floor beside her, heedless of propriety, and looked around at the hundreds of volumes surrounding them. "I had forgotten this room existed." "I spend most afternoons here," Catherine admitted. "When it rains, I come here instead of the garden. It is—" She paused, searching for words. "It is the only place that feels like mine." Edward understood. The library was warm, bright, filled with voices and stories even in silence. It was the opposite of the cold, empty halls. "Will you read to me?" he asked. Catherine blinked, surprised. "What?" "Read to me. Your Latin is better than mine, and I would like to hear your voice." She hesitated, then opened the book again, found her place, and began to read. Her voice was soft but clear, the Latin syllables rolling smoothly, and Edward leaned back against a shelf, closing his eyes, listening not to the words, but to the sound of her. Alive, present, real. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the library, and when they finally descended for supper, Edward felt something shift between them, some small wall beginning to crumble. That night, Edward lay awake in his chamber, staring at the canopy above his bed, and thought about the question Oswin had raised. Heirs. Duty. The consummation that had never happened. He could not deny the practical concerns. He was a duke, responsible for lands and titles that required succession. His father had arranged this marriage specifically to secure those lines. And yet the thought of going to Catherine's chamber, of claiming what was legally his right as her husband, made him feel like the worst kind of man. She had not chosen him. She had not wanted this marriage. She had endured it with a dignity he did not deserve. And now, after 2 years of abandonment, he was supposed to simply appear in her doorway and expect her to welcome him to her bed? No. If they were to have any kind of marriage, real, not merely legal, it would have to be built slowly, carefully, on something other than duty. She would have to choose it. Choose him. And he had no idea if she ever would. A storm rolled in on the 7th night, rattling the shutters and howling through the arrow slits. Catherine woke to thunder and the sound of something crashing in the courtyard, a shutter torn loose, perhaps, or a tree branch broken by wind. She rose, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and descended the tower stair to see if the household needed help securing the estate. She found Edward already in the great hall, directing servants to check the outbuildings and barricade the doors. He turned when she appeared, his expression tight with concern. "You should be abed," he said. "So should you." Thunder cracked overhead, and Edward gestured for a servant to check the north wall. "I need to ensure the horses are secure. The stable roof is old. It may not hold. I will come with you." "Catherine!" "I am not fragile, Edward." She pulled her shawl tighter and met his gaze. "Let me help." They went together into the storm, rain lashing their faces, wind tearing at their clothing. The stables were in chaos, horses stamping and whinnying, the roof groaning ominously. Edward and Catherine worked side by side, calming the animals, moving them to the sturdier stalls, bracing beams that looked ready to collapse. By the time they returned to the hall, they were both soaked through, shivering, their hair plastered to their skulls. A servant brought blankets and mulled wine, and they sat before the fire, steam rising from their clothing. Catherine's teeth chattered despite the warmth. Edward pulled his blanket tighter around her shoulders, his hands lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For not being fragile." Catherine looked at him, her gray eyes bright in the firelight. "I learned not to be. I had no choice." Edward reached out and brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, the gesture tentative, questioning. Catherine did not pull away. "You have a choice now," Edward said. "You have always had a choice. I was too blind to see it. And now? Now I see you." His thumb traced the line of her jaw, gentle, reverent. "And I would very much like to know if you might ever see me." Catherine's breath hitched. She did not answer with words. Instead, slowly, carefully, she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder, her body trembling not from cold now, but from something else, something tentative and terrifying and new. Edward wrapped his arms around her and held her, and outside the storm raged on, but inside, for the first time in 2 years, they were not alone. Dawn came gray and quiet. The storm passed, leaving puddles in the courtyard and broken branches scattered across the garden. Catherine woke in her own chamber, alone but not lonely, the memory of Edward's arms around her still warm in her mind. She rose and dressed slowly, her hands unsteady, her thoughts a tangle of hope and fear. Last night had been, what? A moment of comfort? A beginning? She did not know what it meant or what would come next, only that something had changed irrevocably. When she descended to the hall, Edward was already there, speaking with Oswin, his back to her. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, the memory of the storm between them. "Good morning," Edward said, his voice careful. "Good morning." The servants brought bread and ale, and they ate in a silence that was no longer uncomfortable but rather full, weighted with things unsaid. Finally, Edward set down his cup and looked at her directly. "Catherine, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." Her pulse quickened. "What? Do you want this marriage?" The question was so blunt, so unexpected, that Catherine could only stare at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" Edward leaned forward, his expression serious. "I have given you no reason to want it. I have been absent, neglectful, selfish, and I do not want to continue this way. But I also do not want to force you into something you do not choose. So I am asking, if you could decide here and now, with no duty or obligation binding you, would you want to be my wife?" Catherine's throat tightened. No one had ever asked her what she wanted, not her father, not the solicitors, not Edward himself until this moment. "I do not know," she said finally honestly. "I do not know you well enough to answer that." Edward nodded slowly, as though he had expected as much. "Then may I ask something else?" "Yes. Will you allow me to stay? To try? To see if we might build something real between us?" Catherine looked at him, this man who had abandoned her and then returned, who had seen her loneliness and not dismissed it, who was asking rather than demanding. She thought of the garden, of the library, of his arms around her in the storm. "Yes," she whispered. "You may stay." Over the following weeks, Thornfield transformed. The new servants Edward had engaged began to arrive. A lady's maid named Ella, an older woman with kind eyes who asked Catherine's preferences rather than assuming them. 2 chamberers who kept the fires burning and the halls clean without intrusion. Grooms who cared for the horses and maintained the grounds. The estate woke from its long sleep, filling with sound and movement, becoming something other than a beautiful prison. Catherine found herself overwhelmed at first by the sudden presence of so many people, but Ayla was patient, teaching her how to manage a household, how to give orders without apology, how to inhabit the role of Duchess she had been given but never prepared for. Edward remained. Days became weeks, and he made no move to leave. He spent mornings with Oswin, managing estate business, and afternoons with Catherine, walking the garden, reading in the library, riding across the moors when weather allowed. They talked more easily now, the stilted formality between them softening into something that resembled friendship. But only friendship. Edward had not returned to the question of heirs, had not pressed for anything beyond companionship. He slept in his own chamber, kept a careful distance even as they grew closer, and Catherine was grateful for the patience even as she found herself wondering, hoping, that someday it might be more. One bright morning in early autumn, Edward suggested they ride into the village, a small cluster of cottages and a church 5 miles from Thornfield. Catherine had not left the estate since arriving 2 years prior, and the prospect filled her with both excitement and trepidation. They rode side by side, Edward on his destrier, Catherine on a gentle palfrey Ella had found for her. The countryside rolled out around them, fields gold with harvest, hedgerows bright with haws and hips. Catherine felt the wind in her face and realized she had forgotten what freedom tasted like. The village was modest, its people wary at first. They had not seen their duke in years, had only heard rumors of the young Duchess locked away in the manor. But Edward dismounted and spoke with them plainly, asking about crops and rents and repairs needed, and Catherine followed his lead, listening as women told her about their children, their worries, their small joys. One woman, older, weathered, approached Catherine hesitantly. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but are you well? We have worried." Catherine blinked, surprised anyone had thought of her at all. "I am well, thank you. We heard you were alone up there. No family, no companions. It did not seem right." Catherine glanced at Edward, who was watching her with quiet attention. "I was alone," she said, "but I am not anymore." The woman smiled, and something in Catherine's chest loosened. She had not realized how much she needed to be seen, to matter, to be more than a forgotten duchess in an empty manor. On the ride back, Edward reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For giving me another chance." Catherine squeezed his hand. "Do not waste it." That night, Catherine could not sleep. She lay in her chamber, listening to the sounds of the estate settling, footsteps in the hall, wind in the eaves, the distant hoot of an owl. She thought about the village, about Edward's hand in hers, about the question he had asked weeks ago. "Do you want this marriage?" She had not been able to answer then. She could now. Catherine rose, pulled a robe over her shift, and padded barefoot through the dark corridors to Edward's chamber. She hesitated outside the door, her heart pounding, her courage wavering. Then she knocked softly. The door opened. Edward stood there in his nightshirt, a candle in his hand, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Catherine? What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong." She took a breath. "May I come in?" Edward stepped back, allowing her to enter, and closed the door quietly behind her. The chamber was warm, lit by a single candle on the bedside table, shadows dancing on the stone walls. Catherine stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped before her, and Edward waited, giving her time to find her words. "I have an answer," she said finally, "to the question you asked." Edward's breath caught. "Catherine, you asked if I wanted this marriage." She lifted her gaze to his. "I want to try. I want to see what we might become if we both choose it. Not because of duty, not because of vows spoken by strangers, but because I see you now, Edward, and I think I might like to know you better still." Edward crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones, his eyes searching hers. "Are you certain?" "I am afraid," Catherine admitted, "but I am certain." He kissed her then, softly, reverently, a question and an answer both. Catherine's hands came up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they parted, Edward rested his forehead against hers. "I will spend the rest of my life ensuring you never regret this," he whispered. "Then start now," Catherine said, and smiled, a real smile, the first he had ever seen from her. And so he did. Winter passed into spring, and Thornfield bloomed. The gardens Catherine had tended alone now flourished under the care of groundskeepers, but she still spent her mornings there, and Edward often joined her, content to work beside her in comfortable silence or easy conversation. The estate filled with life, servants who laughed in the kitchens, villagers who came seeking the Duke and Duchess's counsel, travelers who stopped for shelter and left with stories of the couple who had rebuilt their marriage from ruins. Catherine learned to be a duchess, not the ornamental figure she had feared becoming, but a woman of purpose who managed the household, visited the tenants, ensured the estate served those who depended on it. Edward discovered that the wife he had neglected possessed a sharp mind for administration and a gentleness with people that made her beloved in ways his authority alone never could. And in the quiet moments, in the privacy of their shared chamber, for Catherine had moved her belongings to Edward's room by winter's end, they learned each other. Not merely in body, though that intimacy grew sweeter with time, but in spirit. They spoke of fears and hopes, of childhoods and dreams, of everything they had been too wary or too proud to share before. By spring, when Catherine told Edward she was carrying their child, they wept together, not from duty fulfilled, but from joy chosen. Their daughter was born in the gold light of an October morning, small and perfect and loud in her protest at the world. Catherine, exhausted and radiant, held the infant against her chest while Edward sat beside the bed, his hand covering both of theirs, his face wet with tears he did not bother to hide. "She has your eyes," Catherine whispered, tracing a finger over the baby's dark, downy hair. "And your courage," Edward replied. They named her Eleanor, after Catherine's mother, and she became the heart of Thornfield in ways neither had anticipated. The estate that had once been a tomb transformed into a home filled with Eleanor's cries and laughter, with Catherine singing as she rocked the child to sleep, with Edward's low voice reading aloud from the library volumes while his wife and daughter dozed in the afternoon sun. The servants smiled more. The villagers brought gifts, a carved cradle, a wool blanket, a rattle fashioned from silver. Thornfield, which had known only duty and silence for so long, learned what it meant to shelter love. On a morning 2 years after Eleanor's birth, Catherine walked into the garden with her daughter toddling beside her, small hands reaching for rose petals. Edward watched from the doorway, struck by the symmetry of it. This was where he had found Catherine singing, alone and half wild with loneliness. And now she moved through the same space transformed, no longer isolated, but anchored in love she had chosen. He crossed the garden and knelt beside Eleanor, who squealed with delight and threw her arms around his neck. Catherine laughed, the sound bright and unguarded, and Edward looked up at his wife, no longer a stranger, no longer a duty, but the woman who had saved him from his own cowardice by having the courage to stay. "Do you remember," Edward said, rising with Eleanor in his arms, "the first morning I found you here?" Catherine smiled, brushing soil from her hands. "I thought you were a ghost. I had not seen you in so long. I was worse than a ghost. I was a coward." He shifted Eleanor to one hip and reached for Catherine's hand. "But you gave me a chance to be better." "We gave each other chances," Catherine corrected gently. "I could have left, Edward. I could have hardened into bitterness. But I chose to hope. And you chose to stay." Edward pulled her close, his family complete in his arms, and looked around at the garden they had tended together, no longer half wild, but not rigidly controlled either. A balance of care and freedom, much like the marriage they had built. "I will never leave again," he promised. "I know," Catherine said, and kissed him while Eleanor giggled between them. The roses bloomed, and Thornfield stood strong against the moors, and inside its ancient walls, a duchess who had once been too lonely found she was lonely no more. 5 years after Edward first heard Catherine singing in the garden, Thornfield Estate had become known throughout Yorkshire not for its fortifications or its wealth, but for the love that radiated from it. The Duke and Duchess of Wentworth were inseparable, seen riding together across the moors, walking hand in hand through the village, sitting side by side at the great hall table surrounded by their 3 children now, Eleanor and twin boys named Thomas and William. Catherine never stopped tending the roses, though she had help now. And on summer evenings, when the light turned gold and the air smelled of lavender, she would sing in the garden while Edward sat on the stone bench nearby, listening, and their children played at his feet. The loneliness that had once defined them both had been transformed into something neither had believed possible. Not the absence of solitude, but the presence of belonging. They had learned what their marriage vows had never taught them. That love was not given at an altar, but built slowly, daily, in gardens and libraries and quiet conversations, in the choice to stay when leaving would be easier, in the courage to hope when hope seemed lost. Catherine had been too lonely for the estate once. But Edward had found her singing by the garden roses, and everything had changed. If you watched this far, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. And if this tale of second chances touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to choose love. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of courage, hope, and the beauty of beginning again.